Seminar presented by the MedTech Talent Accelerator. Before we get started, I would like to do a land acknowledgement. So McGill University is on land which has long served as a site of meeting and exchange amongst Indigenous peoples, including the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe nations. We acknowledge and thank the diverse Indigenous peoples whose presence marks this territory on which peoples of the world now gather. Okay, today it is my distinct pleasure to introduce our guest speaker, Jan Fossat, Principal Investigator of Klick Labs, who will present a talk addressing translational R&D, digital medicine in a private Toronto lab. Without further ado, Jan, please take it away.
All right, so I'm going to share my screen. Oh, I have a new dialogue here. Sorry, this looks different. Give me a second. Share screen. There we go. All right. Everybody sees my screen? Would assume that's good.
Yes, we can.
Perfect. Okay, well, thank you. I'm going to talk a bit about what I do here in Toronto in a private research lab. I work a lot with colleagues and partners in academia, and I know there's quite a bit of a difference between doing research for the private sector versus doing research in academia. So I'm going to show what we do and how it's different. So I'm Jan Fossat. I'm the PI of Klick Labs, which is a lab that is part of Klick Applied. Okay. So to give you a background of why Klick Lab exists, it's a bit of an anomaly. We are part of an agency, which is called, Klick Health. Klick Health is a commercialization and advertising agency that works for pharmaceutical companies. Unmute. Was I muted?
No. Just for a second.
Sorry.
Okay. A decade ago, we started an innovation lab. The pharmaceutical industry, who are our clients, are very excited about innovation without really knowing what innovation means. But to them, it means cool, shiny object, technology, robots, things like that. So we started a lab that was more like a museum, where we bought a lot of technology. We bought, Google Glass, virtual reality headset, various tech, just to show the clients what they could do with it. And they got very excited, but that's the extent of what innovation means in this world, in the industry. And we wanted to do a bit more than that. We realized, computer's acting up. Next slide. We very quickly realized that technology was not the answer. If you just pump technology at things like, let's do something with virtual reality, or let's do something with any sort of sensor without really having a problem, it doesn't go anywhere. And it just spends a lot of money for no good reason. So we changed the focus of the lab from innovation to something a bit more research-like, which is very simple. We don't start with a solution. We don't start by saying, what could we do with a Fitbit? We start with a question, which is usually medical. There's a knowledge question, or there's a belief, or there's some data acquisition problem. So we have to have a question or a problem, and then a hypothesis, and then an experiment, and eventually validation. Somewhere in the middle might be technology, might be what our clients call innovation, but it's really more a tool than a reason for being by itself. So this seems very normal to academia, but in the industry side, it's always a battle. Clients always come to me saying, what can we do with AI? I'm like, I don't know. What problems do you have to solve, and does it need AI? Whereas in academia, you're going to have a specific question about AI you want to answer. So that's something to know. Is in the private sector, people get excited about the tech without really knowing what to do with it. So from Klick Lab being an innovation place, it became Klick Applied Sciences, which is an actual research lab. And there's a structure. We have 3 different labs. One that's called Healthcare AI. So it's hard for me to say that with my accent. And that's a machine learning lab. We have Information Insight, which is a natural language processing lab. Medicine deals with a lot of text, whether it's FDA documentation or scientific publication. a lot of text that needs to be read and processed. So NLP is very good for that. And Klick Labs, my lab, which is more on the engineering side. So it's experimental technology, digital biomarker, and medical devices. And our goal is to do R&D for tech transfer. So we do research that is sometimes basic, sometimes applied, but the ultimate goal is to commercialize that research. So we do hypothesis generation, we build a variety of prototype, and we validate, we run clinical trials, in whether they're observational or actually experimental, where we try something on patients, and we publish and patent our result. The disciplines that are practiced in my lab is medicine. Obviously, we always interact with disease, so we have to have an idea of the pathophysiology and the etiology of disease. There's a fair amount of engineering because we build things. Data science, even though we have specialized data science lab, we still do data science because we have data. And applied mathematics, we do a surprisingly large amount of applied mathematics. In part because it's much easier to understand than data science. When we find a result through mathematics, we can explain how we found it. When we find a result through machine learning, quite often it's pretty hard to understand what is it we actually found. The working model of a private lab like us is 2 tracks, 2 different ways, which are very similar in the middle. It's essentially doing science. But the top one is self-guided research. Research we do for ourselves, where we start with the questions, either because we heard it at conferences or we realized that this specific area of medicine has an unsolved problem. And we do research, standard process, lead search, hypothesis, prototype, validation study. And at the end, we have, if all works well, we will have a new tool, we'll have some new outcome for the patient, some sort of IP or thought leadership that is useful for patients. And that is something that can be commercialized. We also do lab as a service. This would be clients that hire us to do research for them. This might be the case for a pharmaceutical company who has plenty of expertise in making pharmaceutical compounds, but very little expertise in making, for example, a medical device. So they will hire us to see if we can create a device to detect a specific property of patients that is affected by their drug. The output of our team, very much like any research team, private or public, is patents and publication. This is what I get rated on by my boss. So the more we publish and the more we patent, the better life is for us. I'm going to show you a few examples of the sort of projects we do here. And then I'll talk a bit about the timelines of those projects. So the first one, this is one that is on the tail end. It's almost finished right now. It's a project on detecting a predictive biomarker for asthma. Can we anticipate asthma exacerbation using some measurement device at home? The general concept from a physiology standpoint is that when you breathe in, there's 2 layers of air. You have the air that stays in your trachea and your nose that is just here to push the air that's in the lungs. And then you have the air in the lungs that is chemically reacting with your body. So that the air on top doesn't change, CO2 and oxygen level stay the same. The one at the bottom interacts with your blood. And when you exhale, you have one air and then the second air, in a sense. There's a transition where suddenly you have air that has interacted with the lung. That boundary, the amount of air, the ratio, the temperature, the speed at which those air come together, contains information. All that information is in the time domain. So we created a basic spirometry device that measures time series of temperature, CO2, and flow of air going bidirectionally. This is the first prototype. This is the investigational device that was approved by Health Canada as a Class 2 device for a trial. The study was run at UHN in Toronto. And because we plan to commercialize this, we started doing some human factors and basically some device design to create something that is easy to hold and easy to use, that doesn't have an LCD screen, it just has little LEDs. And this is to do pre-commercial prototype testing. The technology may not work, so this will all go on a shelf somewhere. We're still at the scientific research part, but at the same time, we're already looking at commercial output. Another project, a bit more basic research in a sense, this is glucose homeostasis. There is an ongoing question in the field of medicine about measuring homeostasis as a way to measure health more profoundly. So every system in your body is maintained at some equilibrium, whether it's temperature, whether it's balance, whether it's the level of blood sugar, blood pressure, anything has some mechanism in your body that maintains it where it should be. And when disease happens, a lot of diseases because that homeostasis system is not functioning correctly and your blood pressure is too high, your glucose is too high or something like that. So rather than measuring the glucose or the blood pressure, what if we measure the homeostasis system? It's a bit tricky, but it gives you a more fundamental measure of health. So in order to attempt this, this was very much an engineering mindset. We looked at what's the equivalent to homeostasis outside of medicine. What you see on the bottom left is the homeostasis pathway for glucose level. It's kind of complicated. But in the world of engineering, there's a lot of systems that perform something equivalent to homeostasis, which is equilibrium, maintaining some sort of level. For example, drones have to balance themselves very well. If you bump in the drone, it will restabilize. 3D printing head, the temperature of the head has to maintain a specific temperature very precisely. And if you feed more plastic in it, it will compensate to stay at the same heat. This is done through something called PID controllers, which is proportional integral derivative. It's a very simple mathematical model. And we try to see if we could apply that mathematical model to what the body does. Lo and behold, it works. We found a model that is a proportional integral model that represents exactly the operation of glucose homeostasis in a human body that was published. And that allowed us to extract 3 digital biomarkers, which are purely mathematical objects. One is the classifier of glucose homeostasis. We can tell if you're diabetic, healthy, or pre-diabetic, not by looking at your glucose level, but by looking at the way you maintain your glucose level. We found a effectiveness biomarker, which is sort of a progression towards diabetes. And we've identified phenotypes. It's almost like handwritings, except for glucose homeostasis, that may have some really profound meaning in medicine. So this one's a bit abstract. There was no device. On the other end of the spectrum, the sort of project we do might be very commercial. One of them was self-selection packaging. In medicine, when you sell a drug, you have either over-the-counter, you just pick it up over the counter, or what's it called? I forget the acronym. You essentially need to talk to the pharmacist, or you pick it up from the shelf. Prescription or OTC, that's what it's called. But there's a new class of medication that's emerging where you can pick it up without a prescription from the physician. However, you still need to make sure there has to be some sort of mechanism in place to make sure this drug is good for you. If you go buy aspirin at the pharmacy, you just pick it up. On the other hand, if you buy some medication, for example, for pregnancy, you might need to talk to the pharmacist and they will confirm that you're pregnant, because if you're not, that might have some side effect. So we wanted to create a technology that allows you to do that to an effect. And we created, this is an early prototype. It's a medication box that has a touch screen with a few questions, and you need to answer those questions by just touching them. Once you do that, the barcode appears on the screen, which allows you to purchase it. This is not bulletproof, but for a class of medication, that might be enough. It allows the regulatory bodies to make sure that the patient has actually held the package in their hand and read it. Because if you write some warnings on the box, you have no idea if anybody read it. But if you have to interact with a device to get the code to buy it, it's a higher level of security. So we built a series of prototype and we eventually got it patented. And we now have a series of clients in the US who are looking at implementing this. Another device we did very quickly was, this came out of a brainstorm about wearable technology. A few years ago, there was a lot of hype on wearable technology, whether it was the Apple Watch or the Fitbit or all those gizmos that allow you to track various medical or medical adjacent quantities. everybody was very excited about them because all those long-term disease could be maintained or monitored with wearable. But there's a big problem with wearable technologies is you have to wear them. You have to charge them. You have to not put them in a washing machine like I did with one of my Fitbits. So you can't really count on them. So out of that, we came out with an idea of a sittable, something you can hardly forget, like the toilet seat. Toilet seat is much easier. It's a great place to get medically relevant data. You don't forget it. You don't need to charge it because it's attached to a thing that's in the house, so we can power it. And we created a proof of concept of a biometric toilet seat for older patients with heart failure. When you have heart failure, you might suddenly gain weight very quickly within a day because your body fills up with fluid. You also have there's a timing difference between when your heart beats and when the pulse of blood reaches your leg. That's called pulse transit time, and that is correlated with how well your heart works. So this device measures through the electrodes you see, the copper electrodes. It measures electrically when the heart is beating. Then there's a pulse sensor, the little green dot, that measures when the pulse of blood from the beat reaches your leg. And there's a delay here because it's fluid traveling. It also has weight sensors that measure the weight as you sit on it. It doesn't give you your actual weight because some of it is on your legs. However, your legs are always the same length. So if one day you have a significant difference of weight, let's say 1 or 2 kilos, unless you ate a really, really large meal, it probably means that fluid is accumulating in your body. So this is a warning device rather than a medical grade measuring device. Something else we did more on the machine learning side to test a bit the limit of what machine learning can do for medicine. We took a challenge of blood glucose measurement for type 1 diabetic. What you see here was the raw data we worked with. And if you look at the blue dots that are kind of scattered all over the place, these are the blood glucose level of one patient over time. And the challenge was to anticipate 30 minutes in the future where the blood glucose level will be based on the past at any point in time. And because you can see there's low periodicity. It goes up and it goes down, but it's not something that looks predictable. However, machines are really good at this sort of work. And this is the result of some analysis we did. Blue dots are the actual glucose values. Orange dots are what we predicted from 30 minutes in the past. So every single orange dot was something we predicted 30 minutes in the past for the future. So the prediction was really good almost all the time. There's on the upper right here, there's some confusion, but generally it shows that if the data is not purely random, but in fact it's more chaotic, it is predictable. And with the right method, in this case it was random forest, you can actually calculate things and predict the future in some sort of near window, which is medically incredibly useful because patients with diabetes tend to have to inject insulin based on what their glucose level is right now or what they anticipate themselves it would be in the future. So if you're about to eat a piece of bread, you know your glucose will go up, so you give yourself some insulin, but a lot of it is a guess, whereas a system like that will tell you actually exactly what's going to happen. Occasionally, we do projects that are much more on the communication side of medicine rather than the hard medicine part, diagnosis or imaging. This is communication. We created a platform that is designed for pediatric gastroenterologists, another hard word for me to say, and their patient, children who have Crohn's disease or IBD or IBS. And if any of you has ever gone for a colonoscopy, it's not super pleasant. And when you meet with the doctor after the scope procedure, they might show you a piece of paper that came out from the medical computer with a bunch of pictures of the inside of your intestine, and it will point whatever is it they found. These pictures are not really nice to look at, and children don't like to look at them. They're also really hard to understand and interpret. And generally, kids, even more than adults, don't really want to talk too much about this sort of things and are not happy communicating with the patient. So the amount of satisfaction with the discussion is fairly low. The amount of comprehension and retention of information is really, really low, even more in children. So we created a platform that allows the doctor to generate a 3D fly-through of a virtual intestine that would have the right features, but it's 3D, it's nicer looking. It's not all weird and gooey. And it's a VR app because the kids prefer navigating through it. So I have just a 1.5 minute video that shows the system in action.
This is the like interface that the machine uses, so I can just pick. And here's where we pick either the upper scope or the lower scope. So maybe let's go to the lower GI.
So that system, by the way, was tested in a RCT, a randomized control trial at a hospital, Boston Children's Hospital. It went very well. We published 2 papers. We have a patent for it. And we're now looking at commercializing it, at basically creating a startup for this technology that would increase satisfaction, comprehension, and retention of information, which ultimately benefits the patients and benefits the hospital. In the US, the hospitals are financially penalized if their patients are less satisfied than average. Another device that is more on the patient side and sensitivity towards patient is the teleempathy device. In this case, we were trying to solve an ongoing problem in medicine, which is the lack of empathy for patient, or not necessarily lack, but insufficient empathy. So when you're a doctor dealing with patients who have generally the same disease, if you're a specialist, everybody you see would have that same condition. Eventually, it's human nature. You start not caring as much for them as you can. The empathy is naturally decays over time. So we wanted to see how could we help that? Could we create a piece of technology that transmits what the patient feels to the caregiver so that for a minute or so, they are literally walking in their shoes? And we created a device called the Simpulse. This was for Parkinson's disease. That's the first one we approached, which is a system that records the tremor of somebody with Parkinson's disease in real time as electrical muscle activity, and then plays it back on somebody else by stimulating their muscle. So it's very much like a microphone speaker system, except instead of sound waves, we're recording electrical muscle activity and playing this back. I also have a quick little video that shows it in action.
For the longest time, we were in the same class in school and everything. Same age, we're going through the same stuff all the time.
Same friends, and like to go to the same places and do the same things.
When we look back at old photos, we're not sure who's who.
Not so much now. It's like not being in control of your own body. It's like something else is controlling you and trying to keep you from doing what you want to do.
I'd like to feel the sensation and try and grapple with sort of everyday tasks and see what that's like, what it's like for Jim. Cool. There we go.
Do I feel something? Look at my hand. Look at my hand.
It's like I've lost complete control of my arm.
Yeah, you look like me.
Exactly.
Having felt it, I really kind of.
I'm not sure how to describe it. It's the first time I've ever seen my tremor in somebody else. I want everyone to be able to feel that. Nurses and neurosurgeons could experience it in almost real time, and I think it will be a game changer for them.
So that was a sample of the sort of work we do. And as you can see, it varies from fairly theoretical and mathematics to device and empathy in virtual reality. So what's different from academia? And I'm talking to you as a university, as students from university, because we are very similar. My team is basically people who come from academia. We have the same curiosity, the same skills, the same talent, the same people, the same funding challenges. It's always, I have to battle for money for each of the new projects. But there's some differences working in the private sector. One of them is the funding model. Even though I apply for grants, it's not my only source of funding. I have bosses that I can go ask for money, and it's quite a lot easier. It doesn't work necessarily every time, but sometimes I can just walk down to our CEO and say, hey, we want to do this really cool project. Do we have the money? I can make a little business case for it, and we might get the funding for it. So that helps. The team structure are quite different. In academic research, if you go to the mathematics department, they will do math, and to the engineering department, they will do engineering and math. We have a very cross-disciplinary team. So we need to have a bit of every sort of science in our lab, because we only have a few labs. We don't have a whole department. We don't have a whole university. So the teams are very cross-disciplinary. We also have access to business team. Some of the people in applied sciences here come from a business background. So if I need help with a business plan, we have MBAs and different people who can do that. Our tech transfer process is simpler. The company owns all the IP, and if we create a startup, the company owns it as well. So we don't have to go through the same complicated process of tech transfer that PIs have to do in universities by creating a startup, assigning the IP right to the startup, consulting with the startup. This is quite a lot simpler. The biggest difference is timelines. When I work with partners in academia, the timelines of projects tend to be clocked or somewhat synchronized with the timeline of education. A research project would be the length of somebody's PhD, whereas here our research project would be the length of how much patience our CEO has. So projects tend to take 3 months, 6 months, less than a year, almost always. Occasionally, we literally have a month or two to come out with a prototype that can be demoed at a conference. So it's much, much faster than academia. And it can happen at any time. There's no specific time where things start and begin. I'm currently working on a project that was given to me last week and is due for tonight, which is something that normally would take 3 or 6 months. We had a week and a bit, not even. So that's probably the biggest difference, but it's feasible because the administrative burden is less. If I need to buy something, I just put it on my credit card and expense it later. I don't have to do a lot of bureaucratic process that some of my colleagues have to do. So we're stressed for time, but we have some allowance that help us with that. That is it. That's my presentations. I would love to hear questions from you. That's my last slide. So I'm going to stay on this one. Any questions?
Excellent. Thank you so much. So yes, we invite questions from the audience.
And I can stop my deck and just have my video. That might be easier. There we go. Oops.
Feel free to write your questions in the chat or to unmute yourself and show your video and ask away.
Hi, I guess I'll ask a question first. So hi, I'm Hussein. I'm a graduate student at McGill. My line of work is radiation therapy, physics and radiation therapy. And the question that I have is that oftentimes in scientific labs, we use a lot of open source code. If it's machine learning, it comes from the Facebook open source initiatives, and Google's open source initiatives, and so on and so forth. And I'm wondering if at your lab, the software that you develop or the code, do you use